She moved through the ICU like a nurse with nothing left to prove and everything left to hide. Mercy General's fluorescent lights hummed their relentless frequency as Megan O'Brien clocked in at 0630, her badge catching the overhead glow for just a second before she tucked it into her scrub pocket. 18 months she'd been walking these corridors in Raleigh, 18 months of antiseptic smell and the soft beeping of monitors that never quite stopped, even in the spaces between heartbeats. Her hands were steady as she set down her phone in her locker, but something in the way her fingers trembled, just barely, as she closed the metal door told a different story. The break room cleared the moment she sat down with her coffee. Not dramatically. Not with any obvious exodus. Just a quiet migration of bodies toward the hallway, the sudden discovery of urgent tasks, the kind of coordinated distance that only happened when someone had already been marked. She didn't watch them leave. She watched her coffee instead, the steam rising like something that had forgotten how to breathe, and counted the seconds until the room was empty except for the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of her own presence. 3 years ago she would have asked why. 2 years ago she would have tried to fix it. 18 months in, she understood that some silences were not meant to be broken. Her shift assignment was posted on the monitor outside ICU Bay 4, Megan O'Brien, senior charge nurse, beds 5 through 9. Routine. She'd handled worse in spaces that didn't have walls, in dust storms that turned the sky the color of old blood, with equipment held together by prayers and field tape. This was just a hospital. Just beeping machines and fluid bags and the particular kind of dying that happened slowly enough for paperwork. But bed 7 wasn't empty anymore. Colonel James Hartley was the kind of man who looked like he'd commanded things his entire life and hadn't quite adjusted to being commanded by gravity and cancer. His frame was still broad despite the weight loss, still carried the architecture of someone who'd spent 43 years expecting people to listen when he spoke. The metastatic carcinoma had spread through his abdomen like an invading force, colonizing organs that had nothing to do with the original sin in his pancreas, and now he lay in ICU bed 7 with a clarity in his eyes that didn't match the death sentence written in his scan results. Megan's hands, the ones that had been trembling in the locker room, went absolutely still. She'd seen his photograph once. Years ago. In a frame on another soldier's bunk in Kandahar, the dust of Sanjan Valley still coating everything, covering the image of a lieutenant colonel with a call sign and a presence that made the air pressure change. The same man who'd commanded her son's entire Special Forces unit. The same man who'd carried her boy's body to the helicopter. She felt the faded patch inside her jacket lining, sewn there so carefully that no one would ever find it unless they were looking for it. Unless they already knew what she was. Senior Chief. His voice was quiet. Not weak. Quiet the way a man speaks when he's already done dying and is just waiting for his body to catch up. You're assigned to my care. She didn't flinch. Didn't let the world tilt sideways. Just approached the bed with the measured pace of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before, and in a professional voice that betrayed nothing, said, "Yes, sir." 18 months at Mercy General. Let's get you comfortable. My daughter's flying in from Seoul. His eyes tracked her as she checked his for access, the lines already running clear fluids and the kind of medications that bought time without changing the trajectory. ETA is 16:30 today. I need to be lucid when she arrives. Fully lucid. She's been deployed. She doesn't get home often. Megan nodded, noting the request in her head, the way a nurse does, not in the chart yet, because charts were permanent and requests from dying colonels were sometimes negotiable depending on which doctor happened to control the morphine drip. She was adjusting his blanket, ensuring the edges were tucked with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory in a field hospital, when Dr. Sterling arrived on rounds like a man who'd never been asked to wait for anything. He was tall in the way that tall men often were, inefficient with space, taking up more oxygen than his share. His Rolex caught the fluorescent light like it was personally offended by it, and the way he held Colonel Hartley's chart suggested the chart was something that existed primarily to confirm what he already knew. Sterling had 15 years of oncological experience, which he'd mentioned to various residents, nurses, and possibly the hospital's water cooler. He mentioned it now, consulting it like scripture. "Colonel Hartley," he said, not quite making it a question. I'm going to initiate palliative sedation protocols. Your comfort is my primary concern, and conscious suffering is unnecessary at this stage. I'm not suffering. Hartley's voice hadn't changed. Still quiet. Still that command present sitting underneath like steel. I need lucidity for my daughter's arrival. 16:30, that's 7 hours. I'll manage discomfort. Sterling's smile was the kind smile of a man explaining something to someone who didn't understand their own best interests. Colonel, you're experiencing visceral pain from the peritoneal involvement. The sedation will allow us to manage. I didn't ask for management, Doctor. I asked you to listen. Hartley turned his head slightly, meeting Sterling's eyes with a directness that made the doctor's jaw tighten just barely. My daughter hasn't seen me conscious in 6 months. I need those hours lucid. Sterling didn't pause. Didn't hesitate. Didn't do any of the things a competent doctor might do when a patient explicitly refused a treatment plan. Instead, he wrote in the chart, that particular kind of writing that suggested the decision had been made before the conversation started, and said, I'll write the order for my Dazolam 2 milligrams for every 4 hours, and we'll add a fentanyl drip. He'll be comfortable. He would be unconscious. Hartley's sister, Karen, according to the family history Megan had pulled from the system, was sitting in the family chair beside the bed, her uniform still carrying the crease from the airport, Army National Guard insignia catching the light. She'd been at every bedside visit, and she'd seen her brother's face when Sterling said the word comfortable. Dr. Sterling. Megan's voice was steady, carefully modulated, the kind of nurse-to-doctor tone that suggested a clarifying question rather than a challenge. Colonel Hartley has explicitly requested consciousness for his daughter's arrival. The pain management protocol, can it be adjusted to allow for that timeline? The room did something complicated. It didn't go silent, the monitors were still beeping, the ventilators still wheezed their mechanical rhythm, a nurse station phone was ringing somewhere down the hall, but something in the human space between the 4 people in bed 7 went absolutely still. Sterling's face went crimson. Not gradually. Not with any warning flush. Just red, like someone had switched a light behind his skin, and his eyes fixed on Megan with the kind of intensity reserved for things he decided were below him that suddenly weren't. Nurse O'Brien seems to believe her 2-year degree trumps my 15 years of oncological experience, he said, and he said it to Karen rather than to Megan, which was a particular kind of violence. This is why nursing students don't make clinical decisions, Colonel. They lack the education to understand the complexity of palliative care at terminal stages. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The sedation stands. 2 milligrams for every 4 hours, non-negotiable. If Nurse O'Brien has concerns about the protocol, she can address them with administration. He turned from the bed with the kind of smooth exit that suggested he'd practiced it in a mirror, and then he was gone, his Rolex disappearing down the corridor toward the next bed, the next chart, the next patient whose preferences were negotiable. Karen reached across the bed and squeezed her brother's hand. Hartley's eyes had closed, just for a second, like he was remembering something. Then they opened again, and he looked at Megan with a clarity that suggested he understood exactly what had just happened and who had just sacrificed what. Thank you, he said quietly. Megan checked his full line, adjusted his pillows, and didn't say what she was thinking because what she was thinking involved a patch sewn inside her jacket and a face she'd carried in her memory for 6 years and a particular kind of rage that had learned to move through the world looking like composure. You'll have your lucidity, she said. I'll handle the protocol. It wasn't a request. It was a promise. It wasn't a request. It was a promise. Dr. Sterling entered ICU bed 7 with the sedation order already signed, his Rolex catching the overhead lights as he gestured toward the 4 stand. Colonel Hartley lay propped at 30 degrees, his breathing steady, his eyes tracking movement with the precision of a man still in command of his body if not his disease. When does my daughter arrive? Hartley asked, his voice thin but resolute. The afternoon sun through the window caught the medals folded on the bedside table, bronze star, purple ribbon edges worn from handling. Megan stood at the monitor, reading the latest lactate and phosphate levels, when Sterling announced, "We're starting palliative sedation immediately." Maximum comfort protocol. Megan turned. She took one measured breath. Doctor, the colonel requested to remain alert until his daughter arrives from overseas. She's en route now. Sterling's face went crimson. The color climbed from his neck in splotches, the way embarrassment spreads in men who aren't accustomed to being questioned. Hartley's sister Margaret stood near the window, and Sterling's nephews, both in their 20s, both uncomfortable in hospital clothes, turned to watch the exchange. Sterling positioned himself between Megan and the family, his voice dropping to the cadence he used with junior residents, the tone that made rooms go quiet. Nurse O'Brien seems to believe her 2-year degree trumps my 15 years of oncological experience, he announced to the family as if Megan wasn't standing 3 feet away. Perhaps she'd like to explain her medical reasoning? Her credentials? Her authority to override palliative care protocols? He smiled at Margaret. A smile like a wolf showing its teeth. Comfort is our priority now. Advanced nursing staff sometimes struggle with that distinction. The room went dead silent. Megan felt the accusation land like a blade between ribs, precise and practiced. She had heard this tone before, not in hospitals, but in briefing rooms where rank mattered and questioning orders got people killed. She'd learned to recognize the architecture of public humiliation decades ago, recognized that Sterling wasn't actually angry about sedation protocols. He was angry that she'd spoken. That she'd contradicted him in front of witnesses. That she'd treated his authority as negotiable. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. A single tear traced down her cheek. Not from fear. Not from shame. From the weight of carrying a 700-pound secret while this man performed his authority like a peacock. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling, her hand steady as surgical steel. Colonel Hartley deserves to say goodbye to his daughter, conscious, and you know it. Her voice came out flat. Authoritative. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in situations where lives depended on it. Sterling's smile froze. Margaret's nephews exchanged glances. Hartley's breathing remained steady, unchanged, as if he'd just watched someone return fire. Sterling took one step closer, his jaw clenched tight. Your concern is noted, O'Brien. And documented. He turned to Margaret with a practiced expression of regret. These situations are always difficult. We'll proceed with comfort measures. He wrote something on his iPad without looking back, the stylus moving with the aggressive precision of someone making a record. The next day, Megan entered the break room at 11:24 a.m. carrying a container of leftover pasta and a bottle of sparkling water. 5 nurses sat at the primary table, Jessica from nights, Tom from emergency services, and 3 others whose names she'd learned her first week at Mercy General. All of them looked up simultaneously. All of them stood. Conversations that had been animated, Jessica had been laughing about something, her voice carrying across the linoleum, died mid-sentence. Tom's coffee cup remained suspended halfway to his mouth as he processed the exit. Within 4 seconds, the break room held only Megan and the smell of microwaved popcorn and antiseptic-tinged air. She sat down at the empty table. She opened her lunch container. She counted her breaths, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At 4 minutes and 30 seconds, she threw the pasta away untouched, the fork clattering into the trash with a metallic ring that sounded too loud in the silence. By Friday, the public disciplinary board in the main hallway had been updated. A new notice in bold Times New Roman, laminated and affixed to the cork surface beside announcements about parking lot safety and flu vaccination schedules, Nurse M. O'Brien, written warning, insubordination and overstepping scope of practice, mandatory retraining required. The letters were the standard black, but they might as well have been burned into her uniform with a branding iron. 3 colleagues passed it during shift change, their eyes sliding away from her name as if looking directly at it might transmit infection. Sterling stood across the hallway, arms folded, watching her read her own public condemnation. His posture was relaxed. His expression was satisfied. He waited exactly 15 seconds, then raised his phone to his ear, maintaining eye contact with Megan while dialing. She could see his mouth moving, the slight nod of someone relaying information to an authority figure. His call lasted 90 seconds. When he hung up, he smiled at her, not with anger, but with the confidence of a man who had activated his network and now had only to wait for the machinery to grind forward. What Sterling didn't know was what Megan had been doing during her 12-hour overnight shifts. She'd been reviewing Colonel Hartley's charts with the precision of someone trained to detect inconsistencies in field documentation. She'd cross-referenced medication orders against pharmacy logs, surgical consult orders against actual procedures performed, billed services against treatment records. 3 doses of high-dose chemotherapy agents, cisplatin, docetaxel, carboplatin, billed to Hartley's military insurance over the past 14 days. Not a single dose logged by pharmacy. Not a single vial charged to supplies. A surgical consult for a palliative bypass procedure, $8,400 billed. The surgery never happened. The surgeon's signature on the consult was practiced, professional, and Sterling's handwriting. The billing totaled $47,800 across 12 fraudulent entries. Megan photographed 2 pages with her personal phone, her hand steady as she did it, then returned the chart to the rack. Her hands had held lives together in the dust of Kandahar province. Her hands had performed emergency cricothyrotomy procedures by moonlight while rounds erupted like fireworks. Photographing billing fraud sheets was the kind of work hands like hers could do in their sleep. She'd been running the numbers because billing fraud didn't exist in isolation. It existed alongside other things. Premature sedations. Aggressive chemotherapy regimens that accelerated decline. Patients who'd requested aggressive end-of-life care suddenly shifted to comfort protocols without documented family consent. A pattern that looked like medicine until you cross-checked the insurance claims. That night, her 17-year-old son Marcus found her on the couch at 11:34 p.m., her laptop open to a blank document. "You're doing it again," he said. His voice had the tone of someone who'd learned to recognize his mother's particular brand of exhaustion, the kind that came not from work but from carrying something alone. Coming home with red eyes. Saying it's long shifts. "You're a terrible liar, Mom." Megan closed the laptop without saving. "Just managing some staffing issues. You never talk about work. And now you talk about it constantly. Those are different problems." Marcus sat down beside her, his 16 years of observation suddenly feeling like 16 years of military intelligence training. What happened? She wanted to tell him. She wanted to say that his brother's commanding officer was dying, that the man who'd carried Danny's body from the fire zone was in an ICU bed in the hospital where she worked, that she couldn't save his CO any more than she'd been able to save her son in Kandahar. She wanted to say that sometimes the people trained to heal became the people trained to harm, that systems protected them, that the quiet accumulation of small frauds created mountains of pressure. She wanted to say all of this to the boy who'd never known his older brother, who was growing into his brother's height and shape, who wore his brother's old unit patch on a keychain. Just hospital politics, she said instead. What Megan didn't tell him was that by Monday morning, Sterling would have already moved his pieces into position. He called the hospital's compliance officer, a woman named Patricia Chen who owed Sterling favor from a country club investment deal, with a fabricated timeline of Megan's the dangerous autonomous decisions. He documented incidents that never happened, Megan administering medications without proper verification, Megan removing patients from standard care protocols, Megan circumventing physician orders. He contacted 2 board members who'd benefited from Sterling's consulting recommendations, board members whose children attended expensive private schools funded by Sterling's referral network. Finally, he contacted an attorney in his personal network, a man named Hayes who specialized in hospital liability, with language about reckless nursing staff operating outside standard of care, about exposure, about documentation we can use. By Tuesday at 4:17 p.m., Megan received a summons to preliminary investigation in the compliance office. Patricia Chen looked uncomfortable as she gestured for Megan to sit. The office smelled like institutional coffee and fear, the particular texture of air in rooms where people's careers came to be examined for cracks. "Dr. Sterling has raised concerns about your clinical judgment," Chen said, reading from her screen. His provided documentation of multiple incidents over the past week. Megan kept her expression neutral. Her hands remained on the table, palms down, in the posture of someone testifying rather than defending. "I need to see the documentation," Megan said. Chen slid 3 incident reports across the desk. Megan read them carefully. Each one was dated within the past 7 days. Each one described events that never happened. Medication administration she hadn't performed. Patient removals from orders she hadn't initiated. Conversations with family she'd never had. The reports were detailed, professional, and entirely fabricated. The room tilted slightly, but Megan's breathing remained even. She'd been in situations where the threat was immediate and physical. This was different. This was the slow suffocation of institutional power, the way bureaucracy could erase a person one form at a time. "I need 48 hours to respond to these allegations," Megan said. Chen shook her head. 24 hours. Policy requires preliminary investigation to move swiftly. She paused, her discomfort deepening. Dr. Sterling also mentioned he has additional documentation he's still compiling. Megan stood. She thanked Chen for her time. She walked back to the ICU with her shoulders level and her spine straight, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd learned that broken people don't survive in places that value strength. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling was competent. He'd built the case carefully, documented the frame job thoroughly, activated his network with the precision of a surgeon making incisions. He wasn't a blustering villain, he was a man of institutional power using that power with lethal efficiency. And he still didn't know what Megan had discovered in his billing sheets. Her next shift started at 7 in the morning, and the charge nurse was already waiting at the assignment board with that particular posture of someone delivering bad news to someone they'd already decided not to like. "We're doing a temporary rotation," she said, not quite meeting Megan's eyes. "MedSurg needs coverage. You'll be floated down to 3 West until we stabilize staffing." Megan read the subtext instantly. Sterling had made calls. The charge nurse adjusted her clipboard, still not looking directly at Megan's face, as if sustained eye contact might make her ask follow-up questions. 3 weeks minimum, probably. Maybe longer depending on census. Megan nodded once and didn't argue. Arguing was what a guilty person did. What a person with something to hide did. She simply turned toward the stairwell, her badge hanging from its lanyard, the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat she could almost hear. 20 minutes into her shift on 3 West, she'd already helped a post-op hip replacement patient to the bathroom, restocked supply carts, and checked the foresights on 2 surgical patients who barely looked at her. She moved through the floor like she belonged nowhere, which was exactly what Sterling wanted. A nurse too damaged to be a threat. A nurse relegated to bedpan duty. A nurse no one would miss if she simply disappeared. But she wasn't on 3 West because Sterling needed her gone. She was on 3 West because he needed her in a different building. At 2 p.m., during her designated break, Megan walked the stairs back up to ICU with her badge and a chart she was ostensibly reviewing, a male patient from the morning handoff, someone neutral, someone no one would question her seeing. The unit was quiet in that particular way ICUs are quiet during the afternoon transition, when the day shift was finishing notes and the evening crew hadn't yet arrived. She moved past the main station with her eyes on the chart and kept moving until she could see the medication administration record on the computer at the secondary station, the one that faced away from the main desk. Colonel James Hartley's chart was 3 clicks away from anywhere she should have been looking. She pulled it with the casual efficiency of someone doing routine follow-up, and what she found stopped her breathing for exactly 2 seconds. 3 separate doses of methotrexate carboplatin, chemotherapy agents worth roughly $8,400 per dose, logged as administered at 9:24 a.m., 1:15 p.m., and for 22 p.m. on the date of his admission. She looked at the nursing notes for those timestamps. The first one, patient resting comfortably, monitoring for nausea, vital stable. The second, patient awake, alert, requesting water. The third, patient sleeping, no adverse effects noted. But Hartley had been conscious and alert during every one of those times. She'd seen him herself during the morning, and she'd reviewed the notes from the nurses who covered him. There was no chemotherapy administration documented in nursing notes. No for-push recorded. No site verification. No patient response documentation. Just medication orders that corresponded to billing codes, and billing codes that corresponded to military insurance authorizations worth nearly $25,000. She continued scrolling. Surgical oncology consult billed at $2,100, dated 2 days after admission. The consult was scheduled for Tuesday morning. The surgery never happened. The consult never happened. But the authorization was processed, the insurance billed, the money already moving through the system like a river flowing the wrong direction. Equipment charges appeared next in the record, a specialized chemotherapy pump system rental documented at $1,200 per day for 5 days, total of $6,000. Megan had spent 18 months in ICU. She knew every piece of equipment in that unit by its sound, its weight, its particular mechanical signature. Hartley had received his medication through standard for-push. There had been no pump. There was no notation of one anywhere in the clinical record. She closed the chart. She did it slowly, deliberately, the way someone would close a book they'd just borrowed. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The only thing moving was her mind, which was already 3 moves ahead of where Dr. Sterling intended her to be. The afternoon light cut through the ICU windows in pale gold stripes, and she could hear the ventilators in the distance, that mechanical breathing that never stopped. Somewhere in this building, Sterling was billing for procedures that never occurred. Somewhere in this hospital's financial system, military insurance was hemorrhaging money to cover treatments no patient received. And somewhere in the data, there was a pattern so obvious, so brutally clear, that anyone with actual military medical oversight, any official from the Navy Medical Department, any investigator from Tricare, any auditor who spent more than an hour cross-referencing billing against clinical records, would see exactly what was happening. But that's what made Sterling dangerous. He wasn't operating in the dark. He knew the vulnerability. Which meant he also knew exactly how much time he had before someone with authority started asking questions. She understood then why he'd gone after Hartley so aggressively when she questioned the sedation order. Not because Hartley was a difficult patient. Not because her challenge to his medical judgment actually threatened his ego. But because Hartley was a living, breathing audit trail. As long as Hartley remained conscious and alert, he could verify or refute whether treatments were actually being administered. As long as Hartley had his daughter coming to his bedside, there would be a witness. As long as Hartley lived with his faculties intact, he was a liability. The sedation order wasn't premature. It was preemptive. And now Sterling had positioned himself as the overnight attending. He'd removed her from ICU access. He'd made sure the charge nurse knew not to believe any concerns she raised. He'd isolated her completely, professionally amputated her from any position where she could advocate, question, or observe what he was doing. What he hadn't calculated was that she'd spent 12 years reading records in the dark. 12 years in Kandahar with a medical kit and a flashlight and 30 seconds to decide which casualty would survive the helicopter ride. 12 years learning to spot the patterns that meant the difference between living and dying. And she'd spent 18 months at Mercy General learning which systems were auditable, which records were cross-checked, which inconsistencies were so obvious they could end careers. She stood up from the secondary station, closed the EMR, and walked back toward the stairwell. Her badge clattered softly against her ribs as she moved. The unit behind her was already fading, the nurses absorbed in their afternoon tasks, the patients drifting in and out of sedation, the monitors beeping their eternal rhythm. Nobody had noticed her. Nobody had questioned her. Nobody had any idea that Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien had just walked into her command structure's largest blind spot, read the entire tactical situation, and understood that someone in this building had already scheduled another death. That wasn't the worst part, though. The worst part was that Sterling had handed her everything she needed to stop him. All he'd done was assume that a nurse working med-surg rotation would stay on med-surg. That a person already broken, already isolated, already stripped of credibility, would accept her exile without looking back. He'd never considered that she'd keep looking. He'd never imagined that someone with nothing to lose might be the most dangerous person in the hospital. The cardiac monitor showed a rhythm that made Megan's blood go cold. Bradycardic. Muffled. Colonel Hartley's neck veins distended like purple cords, his skin taking on the waxy pallor of someone whose body was suffocating from the inside. She was 3 hours into the overnight shift when she found him like this, conscious an hour ago, asking about his daughter's flight from Frankfurt. Now his eyes were rolling, his breathing shallow and labored, his blood pressure dropping with each passing second. Cardiac tamponade. The fluid that had been accumulating in his pericardial sac for days, the one Sterling had been monitoring conservatively with echocardiograms and prayer, had finally crossed the line into catastrophic. His heart couldn't fill. His lungs couldn't expand. His body was in revolt. She hit the call button. ICU bed 7, code response, now. Her voice was steady. The part of her that had trembled at Sterling's public humiliation was gone. What remained was something older. Cleaner. A voice like a precision instrument, each word exactly where it needed to be. The monitor beeped its terrible rhythm. 1, 2, 3. Each beat weaker than the last. She was already moving, not running, but moving with the economical grace of someone who had done this before, in places where running meant panic and panic meant deaths that could have been prevented. She grabbed the ultrasound machine from the corner of the room, the one Sterling had forbidden the residents from using on routine monitoring cases. Routine. She pulled the probe from its slot, fingers finding the cord without looking. Muscle memory. The code team was 8 minutes out. She heard the overhead page crackle, ETA 8 minutes, and that's when she saw Sterling in the hallway through the glass partition. On his phone. Deliberately slow. Deliberately stalling. He wasn't moving toward the room. He was moving away from it, his voice low and measured, speaking to someone about a golf game on Saturday. His face showed no concern. No urgency. Just a man protecting his weekend plans. The fluorescent light above bed 7 flickered once, twice, steady. Hartley's eyes found hers. He wasn't unconscious yet. His lips moved without sound, *please. She didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford to. Megan gathered the crash cart supplies with the precision of a chess player 6 moves ahead. Spinal needle, 18 gauge, long enough to reach the pericardial space without puncturing the myocardium. Ultrasound gel, still warm from yesterday's shift. A sterile field she laid across his abdomen, fingers moving like they belonged to someone else, someone who had done this in a dust storm outside Kandahar with incoming fire and a soldier bleeding out from an IED shrapnel wound that had nicked his pericardium. The protocols were the same. The anatomy didn't change. The physics of blood and pressure and desperate geometry remained constant whether you were in a trauma tent or an ICU bed 7 in Raleigh. She turned on the ultrasound. The screen flickered to life, and there it was, the black void of the pericardial effusion surrounding his heart like a suffocating halo. Liters of fluid. Maybe 1.5 liters, maybe more. His heart was a fist clenching against an invisible wall. Hartley, I need you to be still. 8 words. No explanation. No apology. No asking permission. You're going to feel pressure. Then relief. His head moved slightly. Assent. She prepped his skin with chlorhexidine, the antiseptic smell sharp and clinical. Her hands found the angle, subxiphoid approach, 45 degrees, needle advancing under the xiphoid process, threading between the ribs, past the diaphragm, into the space where his pericardium waited. The ultrasound probe in her left hand, the needle in her right, her eyes moving between the physical anatomy and the screen where the needle's shadow appeared like a weapon approaching the target. Advance. Watch. Advance. The needle glinted under the overhead light. And then, the unmistakable flash on ultrasound. The needle tip breaking the pericardial membrane. She pulled back slightly on the syringe plunger, and dark bloody fluid filled the barrel like ink in water. Thick. Old. The color of suffocation. The cardiac monitor's rhythm changed the moment the pressure released. Faster. Cleaner. His eyes snapped open, fully conscious, gasping like a man surfacing from deep water. His oxygen saturation climbed on the monitor, 68, 72, 78, each number a heartbeat returning to normalcy. The room's door burst open and his daughter was there, still wearing her flight suit from Ramstein Air Base, her boots carrying the red dust of 3 continents. She was 28 and looked like she could disarm a bomb with her bare hands, which, Megan realized, she probably could. Army engineer. The resemblance to Hartley was striking, same jawline, same eyes, same quality of absolute focus. Colonel Hartley's hand reached for his daughter's without looking away from her face. His lips moved, and she leaned close, her head bent to his, and for the next 20 minutes they spoke in the language of people who knew time was rationed. His voice was thin but clear. Her shoulders trembled, but not from fear, from the effort of holding back everything she'd been holding since she got the call that he was dying. Megan stood back. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to turn around to know that Sterling was standing in the doorway, watching the man he had ordered sedated, deliberately sedated, hold his daughter's hand and speak words that mattered. His face would be a specific shade of white. His jaw would be clenched. The calculations would already be running behind his eyes, the damage assessment beginning. The code team arrived to find Colonel Hartley breathing steadily, conscious, vital signs stabilizing. They looked at the ultrasound, at the pericardiocentesis kit, at the fluid-filled syringe. The lead physician, Dr. Okonkwo, understood what had happened in the 7 seconds it took to assess the situation. Who performed this? His voice was quiet. Not angry. Clinical. Senior Chief, Megan said, and the weight of that phrase, not nurse, not ICU staff, but a rank she hadn't spoken aloud in 6 years, hung in the air between them like something physical. Dr. Okonkwo nodded slowly. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't ask for credentials. He simply turned to Sterling, who was still in the doorway, and his expression said everything. At 4:13 a.m., Colonel Hartley closed his eyes and exhaled without inhaling again. His daughter held his hand against her chest, and Megan stepped back to give them privacy, moving to the nurse's station where she filled out the time of death in the electronic medical record. For 19 a.m. Conscious. Present. With his daughter. Everything Sterling's sedation order would have stolen. She was documenting the pericardiocentesis procedure when security arrived. 2 officers, both looking uncomfortable, both carrying the expression of people asked to execute instructions they didn't understand. One of them was Jimmy Patterson, who'd worked nights for 4 years and had twice brought his daughter to Megan's ICU after car accidents. He wouldn't make eye contact. "Megan, we need your hospital badge." His voice was gentle. That's what made it worse. The other officer held a folder, thick with paper. Termination documentation. She scanned it without reading the words, her eyes caught only the phrases, scope of practice, unauthorized intervention, creating liability exposure, pattern of insubordination. At the bottom, Dr. Patricia Chen's signature. The CEO who had never set foot in the ICU during night shift. She unclipped her badge and held it out. Jimmy took it like it was contaminated. "You need to leave the building." This from the second officer, reading from a script. "We'll escort you to your locker. You have 10 minutes to collect personal items. You're not permitted to access the hospital system or contact staff." She didn't fight. Didn't explain. Didn't ask to speak to anyone. Her composure was complete, sealed, locked behind eyes that had seen worse losses in a single day than most people saw in a lifetime. She gathered her keys, her phone charger, the photograph of her son in his Special Forces dress uniform that lived on the corner of her locker door. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket was still there, the one she'd worn on 3 continents, the one that matched the patch on Colonel Hartley's shoulder in the photo his sister had shown her. Sterling watched from his office window as security escorted her down the main corridor. He was leaning against the glass, arms crossed, and Megan saw the calculation in his eyes. The immediate threat had been removed. The problem solved. He didn't understand that he'd just removed the only person in the hospital who could stop him. The rain started at 6:15 a.m., falling in sheets across the parking lot like applause for a tragedy. Megan stood at her husband's grave in Oakwood Cemetery, mud soaking through her shoes, her scrub still faintly stained with Hartley's blood. The headstone read, Sean Patrick O'Brien, beloved father and husband, 1978-2019. Below that, in smaller letters that Megan had added herself, dearly missed by those who carried on. I failed, Sean. Her voice was barely louder than the rain. I couldn't save David in Kandahar. I held compressions for 40 minutes and his heart just stopped. And now I couldn't even save Hartley without losing everything again. She reached under her jacket, found the unit patch sewn into the lining, felt the embroidered edges worn smooth from 6 years of her fingers finding it in the dark. I came here to heal people. I became a nurse because I thought I was done with war. But the war followed me. It's still here. It's still taking everything. The rain hammered harder. I don't know how to live in the world anymore, Sean. I don't know how to be invisible. I don't know how to be just a nurse when everything in me remembers being something else. She stood there for 40 minutes, and the mud around her feet grew deeper, and the rain kept falling, and inside Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Richard Sterling returned to his office and deleted the security footage from the ICU hallway, or tried to, not knowing that a Marine veteran working in IT had already backed it up, already sent copies to places Sterling would never find them. What happened next would change everything. Before that afternoon, Dr. Sterling made 3 phone calls from his office. The first went to Richard Bannister, a board member whose son Sterling had placed in a lucrative orthopedic fellowship 8 years ago, the kind of favor that created permanent obligation. The second went to Patricia Hutchins, Chief of Medical Compliance, who had attended Sterling's vacation home in Cabo 3 times on his dime. The third went to his attorney, Marcus Chen, who specialized in protecting physicians from exactly this kind of institutional fallout. By 2:41 p.m., fabricated documentation had been compiled, a fabricated incident report describing Megan's pattern of autonomous medical decision-making that exceeded nursing scope, a falsified statement from a resident claiming Megan had administered medications without physician orders, a lie so specific it might have been believed if anyone had bothered to check the medication logs. Sterling had prepared for this contingency for 3 days, understanding that Megan's careful attention to patient charts had become a liability, that her presence in the hospital was a ticking clock counting down to the moment someone reviewed billing records with actual scrutiny. He had already decided she would not be present for that moment. At 3:15 p.m., Megan was called to the HR office. She walked down the corridor with the same steady pace she'd maintained through 18 deployments, through mud and dust and the weight of bodies that didn't make it home. She didn't know what was coming. That was the only advantage they had. The HR director, a woman named Patricia Chen, unrelated to Sterling's attorney, sat across a polished desk with 2 security officers standing in the hallway, visible through the glass door. Security present meant termination. The termination meant something had moved faster than she anticipated. Ms. O'Brien, we've received several concerning incident reports regarding your conduct in the ICU, Patricia began, sliding documents across the desk with the careful precision of someone following a script. Megan didn't reach for them. She'd learned long ago that documents prepared in haste often contradicted themselves if you waited long enough. These allegations describe insubordination, scope overreach, and Patricia paused, as if reading the words cost her something. Reckless autonomous practice that endangered patient care. The room smelled like coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. I don't dispute that I questioned Dr. Sterling's sedation order. Megan's voice was level. Colonel Hartley was lucid. He requested consciousness for his daughter's arrival. Patricia shifted. That's a medical decision, not a nursing decision. Colonel Hartley is now deceased. Megan met her eyes. He died conscious, with his daughter present, which was his stated wish. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Patricia continued, her voice softer but still formal. The decision has been made at executive level. Your position is being terminated effective immediately. Your badge will be deactivated. Security will escort you to collect personal belongings from your locker. It was clean, efficient, surgical. The kind of removal that left no room for appeal, no process that could be challenged because every step had been documented in advance. Meghan stood. She didn't shake. She didn't ask why. She simply gathered her ID and stood as the security officers flanked her. They walked toward the locker room in a small formation, 3 people moving through the hospital corridors while staff members suddenly became very interested in their phones and their clipboards. She could feel Sterling watching from somewhere above. She was right. From his 3rd-floor office window, Dr. Sterling stood with his phone pressed to his ear, watching security escort Meghan toward the loading dock. He smiled. He'd won. That was what he told himself. He'd removed the threat. Meghan O'Brien was a terminated employee with a documented pattern of misconduct. Whatever happened with Hartley's chart, whatever happened with billing records, she was no longer an insider. She was just another disgruntled nurse with a termination letter and no institutional credibility. He watched until she disappeared into the staff parking area. Then he returned to his desk and opened his email. 47 unread messages. He didn't know, yet, that the hospital's IT director, a Marine Corps veteran named James Morrison, had been contacted that morning by Commander Price from Naval Special Warfare Command with a single request: secure all security footage from the ICU from the past 72 hours, and don't delete anything, no matter what anyone asks. He didn't know that Morrison had been wearing a dress uniform under his IT badge the entire week, ready for this moment. He didn't know that the FBI had already begun requesting records from Mercy General's billing department. For now, Sterling believed he was untouchable. The evening of her termination, Meghan sat in her car in the parking lot for 40 minutes. She didn't cry. That was something she'd stopped doing in Kandahar, the day they carried her son's body to the helicopter. She simply sat and breathed and understood that she'd failed twice now, once in the dust and heat of Helmand Province, and once in the climate-controlled certainty of an American hospital. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus: "Mom, where are you?" She texted back one word: "Coming." She didn't go home. Instead, she drove to the cemetery where Sean was buried, where she'd scattered the ashes of 16 years of pretending to be someone smaller than she was. The rain started just as she pulled into the gravel lot, steady and cold, the kind that soaks through everything. She stood at his grave without an umbrella, mud sucking at her shoes, and whispered words that no one would hear: "I failed, Sean. I couldn't save our boy in Kandahar, and now I couldn't even save his CO without losing everything again." The rain fell harder. Lightning flickered across the sky like distant muzzle flashes. She stood there until her scrubs were soaked through, until the cold had penetrated deep enough to make her shiver, not from fear, but from the weight of a lifetime spent holding things together while everything fell apart. When she finally drove home, the house was dark except for the porch light. Marcus was waiting on the couch, still in his school uniform, his laptop open beside him. But he'd closed the laptop when he heard the car. He was 16 years old and he'd grown into a young man who recognized exhaustion the way soldiers recognize incoming rounds. "Mom." He stood up. She was dripping water onto the hardwood floor. She was still in her scrubs. She smelled like a grave and rain. She didn't answer him. She simply walked to the kitchen and sat at the table. Marcus followed her. He watched her for a long moment, then he left the living room. She heard him in the hallway closet, moving things. When he came back, he was holding something. A shadow box. Old wood, glass front, the kind that holds things you don't want to lose but can't bear to display. He set it on the coffee table in front of her. Inside, arranged on midnight blue velvet, were 4 objects. A navy cross. 2 silver stars. The faded unit patch she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining, the one with the crossed rifles and dagger of Special Forces. And beneath it all, ribbons. Combat Infantryman Badge. Purple Heart with 2 stars. Joint Service Achievement Medal. Purple Heart with 2 stars. All of it burnished, all of it real, all of it proof of a life she'd spent 18 years erasing. Mom, they need to see these. Marcus's voice cracked on the last word. Megan couldn't look at him. She couldn't look at the medals. She looked at the patch instead, the same unit insignia that Colonel Hartley wore. The same unit her son had served under. The same unit that had carried her boy's body away from an ambush in Kandahar province. She didn't answer Marcus. She couldn't. The next morning, when sunlight cut through the kitchen window at 6:14 a.m., Megan was still sitting at the table in yesterday's scrubs, the shadow box still in front of her, the medals catching the light like accusations. Marcus found her exactly where he'd left her 8 hours ago. He didn't say anything. He simply called the number he'd found in his father's old letters, a number for someone named Commander Price, Naval Special Warfare Command Liaison. It took 4 minutes on hold before Price answered. It took 1 minute to explain. It took 2 hours for Price to drive from Fort Bragg to Raleigh, arriving in full dress uniform, his shoulder boards catching the hospital lights like warning beacons. By that time, Megan had changed out of her scrubs. She'd put on the dress blues she hadn't worn in 6 years, the ones that hung in the back of her closet like a skin she'd outgrown. They fit perfectly. At 10:02 a.m., she stood in the hospital CEO's conference room. The CEO sat at the head of the table, confused. Dr. Sterling stood in the corner, his face already pale because he understood, somehow, that he was about to stop winning. Hospital security lined the walls. Then Marcus spoke. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, Naval Special Warfare. The CEO's hands trembled. She opened a file that Commander Price had delivered, and began reading. 18. Deployments. Embedded medic with Special Forces 18s in Kandahar Province. Kandahar Province. Logar Province. Paktia Province. 3 citations for heroism under fire. Combat diver. Qualified trauma surgeon. Author of 2 innovations in battlefield hemorrhage control that are now standard protocol in 3 services. The CEO's voice broke. She kept reading. Senior Chief O'Brien received the Navy Cross for treating 14 casualties under direct fire during a 12-hour siege in Sanjin Valley, August 2009. Commander Price stepped forward in his dress uniform, the fabric crisp enough to cut. He spoke with the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed. 2 silver stars for tactical medical operations I'm still not cleared to discuss. 3 Purple Hearts. 2 from Iraq. 1 from Afghanistan. He looked at Sterling. Do you understand who you just terminated? Sterling opened his mouth. No sound came out. That's when FBI agents entered the conference room with a search warrant and a stack of documents that would take 4 hours to explain. The hospital's IT director, James Morrison, connected his laptop to the room's screen. Morrison's marine tattoo was visible on his neck, a bulldog with a rifle. He didn't smile. Dr. Sterling requested I delete security footage from last Thursday evening. The night Colonel Hartley experienced cardiac tamponade. The screen flickered to life. There was Sterling, standing in the ICU hallway, phone to his ear, watching Megan through the glass partition while the code alarm flashed red. The timestamp showed 11:56 p.m. He stood there for 4 minutes. For minutes while Megan performed the pericardiocentesis that saved a conscious man long enough to say goodbye to his daughter. For minutes while Sterling, the commanding physician, waited in the hallway. I saved every frame, Morrison said quietly. And I reported it to the State Medical Board yesterday. He looked at Megan. Senior Chief. She nodded once. Morrison nodded back. The FBI agent produced documents. Billing fraud across 18 months, chemotherapy never administered, $87,000. Surgical consultations never performed, $52,000. Equipment charges for supplies never ordered, $201,000. Total fraudulent claims against Tricare and Veterans Administration Insurance, $340,000. Sterling's signature on every one. Sterling's attorney arrived within 20 minutes, but by then the CEO had already called security. "You're terminated, effective immediately. Your medical license is suspended pending investigation by the State Medical Board and the FBI." Sterling's face went the color of old bone. He tried to speak. The CEO continued as if he wasn't there. "You'll be escorted from the building. Your office will be secured pending the fraud investigation." They took him out the same way Meghan had been taken out, flanked by security, moving through corridors where people stopped and stared. This time, no one looked away. Within 72 hours, Sterling's medical license was permanently revoked. The fraud charges carried a 10-year federal maximum, but his attorney negotiated full restitution, permanent prohibition from practicing medicine, 18 months in a minimum security facility. 6 months later, Meghan heard he was teaching CPR certification courses at Raleigh Community College for $15.75 an hour, standing in a fluorescent-lit classroom, showing people how to save lives he'd spent his career destroying. She didn't celebrate. She understood something Sterling would never grasp, that power isn't a title. Power is the ability to help. 3 weeks after Sterling's arrest, Meghan stood on the Pentagon steps in her dress blues, the first time she'd worn them publicly in 6 years. The morning was clear and cold. The Undersecretary of Defense for Health Affairs shook her hand for the cameras, his palm warm and slightly damp. "Senior Chief O'Brien, we're asking you to consult on updating combat medic training protocols. Your 18 deployments, your field innovations, they're exactly what we need." Photographers snapped images. One would appear in Navy Times, another in the hospital lobby on a brass plaque beside Colonel Hartley's memorial. Marcus had framed the Pentagon photograph and hung it next to his brother's memorial image. That evening, she trained the first cohort of ICU nurses at Mercy General, teaching the pericardiocentesis procedure that had saved a consciousness, one final goodbye. A resident asked how she'd stayed calm. Meghan touched the unit patch, now visible on her training jacket, no longer hidden. "True class is what you do when the lights go out." The remark stayed with them. It became the motto of the medical team. At home, Marcus showed her an acceptance letter to the Navy SEAL medic pipeline. She held him for a long moment. Then she stepped back and saluted. He returned it, tears streaming down both their faces. Outside, rain fell softly on Sean's grave, washing the winter mud away. Subscribe for stories of hidden heroism and untold valor. Like if you believed Meghan deserved vindication. Comment, what would you have done in her position?